Bro, is shunning proof? No, they got me good. The first time I got shunned was for drinking a little bit too much and driving my horse and buggy through a clothesline and just demolishing Leroy Byler's clothesline. And the second time that I got shunned was when I left the Amish, and I have been shunned since that time, since that day. When I left the Amish, the elders came to see me, and they told me that if I didn't come back, I was going to get shunned. I said, well, you're going to shun me anyway for having left. The act of leaving in itself and getting a haircut is going to lead to me being shunned. And they said, yes, but we could wait until your hair grows back. I said, it's okay, don't worry about it, just go ahead and shun me whenever. I'm not planning on coming back for a couple months at least. And so they said, okay, we'll see ya. And that's the last I really heard from them. And they went back home. And that next Sunday at church, they shunned me, and I have been shunned since that day. It doesn't really affect me unless I go around Amish people. When I'm not around Amish people, it doesn't affect my everyday life. So for those that leave the Amish, it only affects them when they try to go back and visit. Loved ones have weddings or funerals and stuff. It'll affect them sometimes then. Like, I have not been able to go to any of my siblings' weddings since I left the Amish. My older brother was the only one that was married when I left, and I have not been able to attend any of my sister's weddings. My younger brother's wedding I was not able to attend. So, it's kind of sad in some ways, but at the same time, it was the life I chose, and I accept the shunning that comes with that. It's part of the overall decision in leaving the Amish is the knowledge that you will get shunned. So hopefully that explains things. And yes, I am not shunning proof. I have been shunned for a very, very long time. Adios. So there's been a lot of confusion on this shunning topic, and some people think it means you're shunned forever. Some people think I got kicked out of my home, kicked out of my community. I only got shunned for 2 weeks. 2 weeks was the minimum sentence, and that's because you can only get shunned or unshunned at church, and we only have church every 2 weeks. At the end of church, before we sing the final hymn, the bishop always makes an announcement. He will say, for example, the next church services are to be held at Abe Yoder's in 2 weeks, Lord willing. And then sometimes he will say, and the brothers and sisters can remain seated after the hymn is over. And so we'll sing the hymn, and then everybody files out except the baptized members. So if you're not baptized, you really don't know what goes on behind those closed doors, and you've never actually experienced real shunning. A lot of communities and families still shun their kids for leaving, even if they're not baptized, but it's not technically shunning. It's not illegal shunning. It's just the family's interpretation. If you're baptized, you're not supposed to tell your younger buddies or brothers or anybody anything that goes on, because they're considered, if they're not mature enough to be members, they're not mature enough to know what goes on. You might hear rumors before you get baptized about what it's like, but you will never know until you're there. So the day that my shunning kicked in was 2 weeks after the day of my drinking incident. And all day at church, it drug on forever. I had this just weighing on me. And the final hymn was sang, everybody filed out, and Owen Dotweiler says, where there's a vineyard, there's always work to be done, pruning, weeds to be pulled, and the same is the case in our church. A young man came to us and told us that he went and bought some beer, and he gave it to, his buddies, and so, we bring this before you, and we ask that this young man give us the room. And then he said my name. I went outside. I waited for about 10 minutes while they did a vote, and everybody was okay with shunning me, which wasn't a surprise. And Alvin Raber comes out and said, okay, you can go home. You are now officially shunned, and you are not able to eat lunch with us. So I went home, and before lunch, I just booked it out of there. So I went home, and I was hungry. So I wasn't supposed to touch the food without it being handed to me, but I didn't know what else to do. So I went and got a loaf of bread and a jug of milk, and I made me some chocolate milk and a sandwich, and I just never told anybody. and it didn't seem to hurt him. I'm going to have to do a part 2 on this one as well. Welcome to what shunning felt like, part 2. So after I went home, I made me some food, you know, cleaned up all the mess so that nobody would know, and just kind of hung out. I wasn't allowed to go to the singing that evening. Obviously, I was grounded as well, or, you know, shunning, part of that is you can't go to a singing. So I wasn't allowed to see my girlfriend, and that was probably the hardest part for me. Me and my buddy Lester both had girlfriends up in Ashland, and we would only see them like every other week or so because it was expensive to hire a driver to go see them. That was actually the reason we were drinking together that afternoon, because we normally hang out together in another community. And, you know, we weren't going to see our girlfriends that weekend, and we were bored, so that's why we were drinking. The next day, I went to work. I worked all that first week like normal. I sat off to myself a little bit to eat my lunch, you know, and kind of worked by myself a little bit, which I didn't mind. And until I had to hand Checky a level on Friday of that first week. And then the second week, I didn't get picked up, but that was okay. I didn't mind that either. And it was, I think, the middle of November, you know, and I wanted to go deer hunting, but my dad said that it wouldn't be good if I got a deer during that time. So I told him I'm going anyway. I'm just not shooting anything. So 2 weeks later, church was at my house, and it was kind of interesting because when you're shunned, you have to go to this little separate room and where the preachers are and take counseling from them on what you've done. And the funny thing is, it was actually my room. So I went up to talk to the preachers, and I sat on my bed while the preachers were sitting on a bench facing me. It was just the weirdest experience of all of this was that I could almost laugh out loud, you know. Like it was my own room. It felt so weird to have all the preachers sitting in my room while I'm sitting on my bed and they're counseling me on drinking. So I wasn't told that my sentence was going to be 2 weeks. I was just told that I was shunned. So after services were over, I had to leave the room because I was considered a shunned member. I wasn't allowed to be there for, you know, the discussion. So they did a vote and everybody agreed to unshun me and that I was repentant enough. So I had to basically go back inside and do a confession, and then I was considered a member again. And the Saturday a week before I got unshunned, the preachers came to see me and they asked me if I had apologized to Leroy Bowler for tearing his clothesline down. And I said no, and they said, well, you're going to have to. So I went and did that. So I got baptized in the middle of September, and by the end of October, early November, I was already being shunned for drinking. I look at the Amish, especially once you get baptized, it's like a members only club. And once you sign up, you know the rules. Or like getting your driver's license, you have to study the rules beforehand. It reminded me a lot of joining the Amish church when I had to get my driver's license. You got to study all the rules, memorize them. And guess what? It might not be a sin if you run a stop sign, but there's consequences. Same with shunning. It's no different. So what happened the day I got shunned, me and my buddy Lester left church at Owen Datwaller's place, and they weren't going to have to singing. It was going to be about 6 miles away at Leroy Byler's. So anyway, we left church and we decided to go get us some beer. And they had 30 packs of Miller Genuine Draft for $11 each. And we each bought one of those. And then they had bottles of rum that we got as well. And it was all 40 proof or lower. And so we went back to the place where church was held. I picked up my buggy. I had to take my sister to the singing. And even though it was about 2 or 3 hours before the singing started, I went and picked her up. And sometimes we would go home and then leave for the singing. So the people that were still at Owen Datwaller's house, they didn't know where we were going. So we headed off to this field, and Lester followed us, and we parked there, and I just left my sister on my buggy and kind of ignored her and gave her a beer and was like, here, try this. And I went over to Lester's buggy, and we were listening to the Cleveland Indians game on the radio. We were huge Indians fans, and we loved to listen to the game every Sunday afternoon usually. I go back over to check on my sister, and I heard this glug, 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 and she had found my bottle of rum, and she was just chugging it. And I was like, oh no, you can't have that. Like, that is not good for you. You know, you can't drink that much at once. And I always watched how much I drank so that I wouldn't get into trouble. So I took the bottle away from her, and I hid it when I walked around the back of the buggy, and I opened up my back curtain, and there was a little flap there, and I hid the bottle under that. And then I went back over to Lester's buggy, and pretty soon I heard this glug, 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 and there she is at it again. She had reached under the seat and gotten the bottle. And so I took the bottle away from her, but the cap was nowhere to be found. And while I'm looking for it, I tipped over the bottle, dumped rum inside my buggy. It smelled like alcohol the next day. By this time, things were rapidly spinning out of control, and I told Lester, we better get to the singing soon or we're going to be too drunk to make it. I'm not going to have enough time to put everything in this video, so I'm going to have to do a part 2. Welcome to What Got Me Shunned, part 2. So we decided to leave the field after we couldn't find the cap to the rum bottle, because I knew that spelled trouble, and me and Lester were already getting drunk, and I didn't know how much rum my sister had. So we left for the singing about an hour before the singing was supposed to start. We get to this intersection, and Lester takes the wrong turn, and he's behind me, and I looked in my window in the back, and he went straight, and I'm like, he's headed for home. So I turned around and chased after him, and I tried to pass his horse, but most of the Amish horses are retired race horses, so if you try to pass them, they'll speed up on their own. It's just their instinct. And so I'm like telling my horse, come on, let's pass him, you know, trying to urge it on. And then I woke up, and I had passed out, and my horse is walking at this point, and his horse and buggy is nowhere to be seen. And we're about a half mile further down the road than from when I last remembered. And his house is like another half mile. So I drive in behind his barn where they usually parked, and looked everywhere, could not see his buggy anywhere. So I'm like, he must have taken the next road and headed towards the singing. So I went back out of his driveway. His parents were probably wondering who I was, and went back out of the driveway and took the next road and headed over to the singing at Leroy Byler's. And on the way there, I finished the last of that bottle. And I don't remember too awful much of the drive. I just remember that when we got there, that the driveway went straight, and then the house was to the right and the barn was to the left. So I drive up to the corner of the house, drop off my sister, and then I drive straight for the barn. And I didn't realize I was in the yard. That they had a real weird driveway that comes up, makes a sharp left, and then a sharp right to head out to the barn. Well, I just drove straight up to the house and then straight through the yard, and I didn't realize it until I hit the clotheslines. And the clotheslines like jerked my buggy way back, and then they snapped, and my buggy just went through. And I was like, oh crap. And I drive on out into the barnyard, parked my horse, unhitched the horse, and I was leading him in to get him a drink before I tied him up. And a couple of little kids are standing there flashing a flashlight in my eyes, and they're saying, are you okay? Did you know your reins are still on the ground? They're dragging. I'm like, would you put those up for me, please? And he was like, okay, and he did that, and then he was like, you want me to tie your horse up too? I'm like, sure. And I hand him the horse, and I went back and I sat on my buggy. And about 10 minutes later, my buddies come out, and I'm running out of time again. I'm going to have to do a part 3. Sorry, y'all. Welcome to What Got Me Shunned, part 3. If you haven't seen the first 2, go check them out. They're on my page. And also hit that follow button if you haven't done so already. I will try not to let you down. So after one of the young kids put my horse away, I went back and sat on my buggy. My buddies come out, and they're like, what are you doing on Danny's buggy? I looked around, and I'm like, this is my buggy. And then I was like, oh crap, it's not. And then I went back over and sat on my buggy, and Danny was one of the kids eating supper. And he comes out, and he's like, who was on my buggy? And I was like, not me. And he was like, I think it was you. And everybody, I think, pretty much knew there was something wrong with me. And so I'm telling him what happened. I'm like, did Lester show up? And they're like, no, he never showed. So I'm like, crap, where is he? You know, but I was too hazy to worry too much about it. So we went into the singing. About halfway through the singing, I started feeling sick. And I left, and I remember it felt like I walked a mile out through the barnyard, but I saw it later, it was only like 100 feet. And I walked back there, and I lay on the ground, and I just puked my guts out, and I dry heaved, and that was the first time I had ever thrown up. I was really questioning my choices at that point. Went back into the singing, and the clock was behind me. I kept looking back to see what time it was, but there was 4 clocks floating around in this little circle. I couldn't really focus on them. So finally the singing ended, and we went home. But I didn't find out until Tuesday that Lester had gone home, and he had passed out, put his horse away, doesn't have any recollection of it, and walked into the house while his parents were still awake. And they were in the kitchen with the bright light, and they were like, "What's going on?" And he was like, that's the first thing he remembers after leaving that field. And he said he felt sick, so he went up to bed, you know, and passed out. And his dad went out and checked his buggy and found all the alcohol and all the stuff on his buggy. And there was plenty of witnesses that had seen us leaving that afternoon. And Lester wasn't a member of church, but I was. So Lester wasn't baptized, but I was. So his dad went and told Alvin Raber, my deacon, about the story. And Lester's brother came and told me that the truth is out. And so I went and talked to Alvin Raber as well. I knew he knew, but I figured I'd save him a trip. I told him what happened. I tried to make it sound better for myself, of course. I told him I didn't throw up, and I lied to him. So that's not a good thing, but that's something that most kids do when they're trying to avoid punishment. But I got shunned anyway because I was the older kid and I was looked at as a bad influence.